Yeah, there we go. Okay, hopefully you can see the screen as well. So, hello, I'm Eleanor Heuvel from Brunel University, and I've been there 25 years this year. But I only began working in clinical sciences and working on dementia in 2018. So this is a relatively new field for me. So the work I'm going to talk to you about today has its origins in the IDEAL project, which originally ran from 2014 to 2019, but now it's been extended as the IDEAL programme and due to finish in 2022. This study is headed up by Professor Linda Clare from Exeter University. And IDEAL is investigating how assets, resources and services affect adaptation and coping with the challenges of dementia, influence the ability to live well for people with dementia and carers. So IDEAL recruited from memory services and other specialist dementia services from 30 areas in England, Scotland and Wales for a longitudinal study of living well with dementia. And the programme recruited a baseline cohort of over 1,500 people with dementia and 1,200 carers. And when our part of this study began in 2018, the IDEAL participants were just getting ready to complete their 4th yearly questionnaire, covering a whole host of questions about factors that could affect living well with dementia. But one of the problems with the study was that only 1% of the participants were from ethnic minority backgrounds. Largely, it seems, because people from these communities present late, if at all, to memory clinics. The second phase of the IDEAL programme, IDEAL 2, is attempting to include the perspectives of underrepresented groups, such as those living with undiagnosed dementia, those with advanced dementia, and for our part of the project, people from Black and ethnic minorities, and our work funded by the Alzheimer's Society. Got the wrong way. So after the Second World War, the British government encouraged people from British colonies and newly independent Commonwealth countries in the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent to migrate to Britain to help the country rebuild. Many of these workers put down roots in the UK, had children, grandchildren. So the African Caribbean and the South Asian communities are the largest and oldest minority ethnic communities in the UK. And for this reason, we focused on reaching these 2 groups of communities for our part of the research. So because the original recruitment methods clearly didn't work for these communities, it was proposed to use community engagement as a means of recruiting people into the project. The idea was to start with community leaders, people who organised or led community groups or faith groups, and interview them to find out what they thought the issues would be. Community leaders were also able to introduce me to older members of the community and to help me make contact with potential participants. As part of the community engagement process, I also developed a short presentation to explain about memory problems, why research is important, and to explain the research process. I presented this at various community groups, which allowed me to invite people to help with the research. And I was able to interview people with memory problems and carers. With some help from community leaders and using some of the insights gained from the interviews, I developed a sort of cut down version of the original IDEAL questionnaire. So this would be used to gather quantitative data that would augment the findings of the main data set. In the proposal, it was suggested that we would survey 50 people from the South Asian communities and 50 from the African Caribbean communities. And where possible, corresponding family carers as well. And then we'd follow them up after 12 months and get a sort of mini longitudinal study. I think it became obvious fairly early on in that project that this was rather overambitious. And of course, COVID-19 has been a huge obstacle to recruitment, to community engagement, and to doing some of the important follow-up work. What I am doing is asking carers to complete the ideal questionnaire, and I've created an anonymous online version to make it easier to take part. At the end of the online version, there's an option to be contacted for a follow-up interview. This is to replace the 1-year repeat questionnaire, which I'm not going to have time for. And also the follow-up interview is really important because this allows people to talk about some of the specific challenges they face as part of an ethnic minority community. Of course, there are no questions about this aspect in the original ideal questionnaire. And also, interviews will allow us to get rich data from the reduced number of participants. So before I tell you a bit about what I've found out so far, I want to be completely upfront about the help I still need with this project. I think there are 2 things that are going to be vital to ensure this project answers our 2 research questions. And the research questions are these: what factors support living well for people with dementia and carers from BAME communities? And how can we best support the inclusion of people with dementia from BAME communities in future work? To answer the first one, I really need more carers to fill in the ideal questionnaire. So if you have contacts, groups, or anyone at all who might be willing to invite people to take part, that would be an enormous help. Just let me know. I could post my email in the chat. And to help me answer both questions, I need feedback, questions, criticism, review of what I'm doing. I'm not an expert in this topic, and I'm trying to learn from the people who are. So I'm going to try and leave plenty of time at the end of the presentation for discussion. So let me tell you a bit about what I've found out so far. I think the first thing to note is that recruitment is really difficult, and much more difficult than anyone actually anticipates. And I have to say here about my hero, David Truswell, without whom this project would never have got off the ground. Back in 2018, David came all the way out to Brunel, and it is a long way on the tube, and spent a couple of hours talking things through, explaining things to me. And one of the most important things he said was, there's no point in cold calling. You can't simply approach people as a complete stranger. You must have an introduction from someone who's trusted. And it was through David's generous introductions that I was actually able to meet community leaders and visit community groups. I spoke to people who ran day centres or older people's groups, as well as to Hindu, Sikh and Muslim faith leaders. I asked about the challenges of ageing in their community, and more specifically about attitudes to ageing and memory problems and where people look for help. And I also asked how ethnicity impacted on the experience of ageing with memory problems. What I learned from the community leaders informed my approaches to the community, and I was able to speak to a couple of guys with dementia diagnosis, family members but who didn't have a direct caring experience, women who'd been carers for their mothers, and one current carer who was very active in the community. So what I'm going to share with you now is just some of the more frequently mentioned topics that came out of these interviews, and then I'll go on to talk about some of the underlying things that seem to be coming out. So let me see. So I don't know if you can see those quotes. I'm not going to read them all out. One of the themes that we see in the literature is the culture of family care, and this was borne out by these interviews. Both Asian and African Caribbean leaders and community members expressed the view that the extended family should be the main source of support and care for older people with memory problems. But many felt this culture was changing or maybe no longer possible in 21st century UK. The children were moving away for work or not able to afford to live in London, and that was causing the families to break up and not be close enough to really care. You can see the quotes there. So faith and faith communities were also mentioned very frequently. This is partly, of course, because some of my first contacts were faith leaders, but even among community leaders, families and carers, religion and faith communities had a key role in many people's lives. So I particularly like this quote from the Carribean day centre manager, who said, well, for the BME group and religion, it's part of our culture. It's like wearing our skin colour. It goes hand in hand, at least for the older generations, she was saying. And there's a couple more quotes there. Of course, there were also negative aspects to faith, such as the belief that faith alone was the way to deal with a medical problem, or the feeling that suffering and difficulties were their karma, or maybe the will of God, so no attempt should be made to seek help. But overall, faith and faith communities seem to be a source of strength for many people. Faith communities were also mentioned as a way of reaching ethnic minority communities with health information and support, rather than going off somewhere strange, but to go to the places where people felt comfortable and where they were going anyway. So the third important topic that came over very strongly in the interviews was to do with barriers to seeking and getting help for memory problems and dementia. One very important one was stigma, in particular thinking of dementia as a mental illness that might have been caused by something that either the family or the person themselves had done wrong, or believing that the family would be ostracized due to the illness. Another barrier was not actually knowing the difference between normal aging and dementia. These communities generally migrated at a young age, and they may have little experience of normal aging. Yeah, there's the lady in the middle here who said, however, because of, for example, the African and Caribbean community and the Asian community in this country have very limited experience of significant old age. Therefore, they have a very limited experience of dementia. And also, still on barriers, in the UK, the first port of call for medical issues and the gatekeeper for specialist services is the general practitioner. But the experience with accessing services through the GP were mixed. There was a level of distrust, particularly in the Caribbean community, with one community leader telling me her community wouldn't get the same medicines or treatment as the majority population. Yeah. First, I was shocked by this, but actually when you look at the literature on mental health, Black people are far less likely to be prescribed talking therapy and far more likely to be hospitalised than the majority population. So maybe she had a point. There was also the feeling that the GP didn't take a family's concerns seriously, so that the help needed wasn't forthcoming. Some felt that even after diagnosis, there was very little help in pointing people towards services to help manage the condition. Of course, many of the issues affecting people living with dementia from BAME communities also affect the white majority population. But I think that what my research is beginning to show is that there's a whole extra layer of complexity that could be a barrier to living well with dementia for Black and South Asian people in Britain. And this definitely resonates with what others are finding and what David Trustwell has found in the book he edited, which is so brilliant. One of the obvious things, layers of complexity, is that although many of these people have lived most of their lives in the UK, their culture, their food, their dress code, social interactions will often derive mainly from their countries of origin. So when they need to interact with services which are designed for the majority, they can feel strange and out of place. Just one example that someone pointed out to me was that it's quite common in this country for people to refer to their health and social care practitioners, to call people by their first name. But for Caribbean and African communities, this is disrespectful. It just adds to that sense of confusion and anxiety that can be associated with dementia. It can be quite upsetting too. Language is another big issue, particularly for the Asian communities. Many of the older ladies in particular have limited English, and have a significant proportion had little education in their own home country, so can't read their native tongue. Also, there are so many different languages in the Indian subcontinent: Hindu, Urdu, Punjabi, Tamil, to name but a few. As one Afghan Sikh community leader told me, the thing is, they're Asian too, but they don't speak the same languages. Just because you're brown, it doesn't mean that you speak the same language. And I think one of the really worrying things, these communities experienced terrible racism when they first arrived in the UK. And although it's no longer socially acceptable to express racist views, there's little doubt that racism still exists. One community leader said to me, "Yes, well, to be honest, if you change yourself into a black person for a day, you will meet tremendous hardship. Tremendous hardship. Just by presenting yourself into any organisation or institutions, you are 10 steps behind your white counterpart." Shocking, really. Most people I spoke to are more understated than that, but clearly discrimination and racism is an ongoing issue. One lady spoke about being a lodger in the UK rather than being at home, although she's lived here for 46 years. A Muslim leader, just quite casually into the conversation, spoke of hostility and unwelcoming. And the only South Asian social worker in one area was allocated all the Asian clients without checking with the clients whether that's what they wanted, and certainly without checking with her. And maybe the issue of racism has been the elephant in the room here in the UK. But in the last year, there have been a number of investigations and reports. BMJ ran a special issue in February last year on racism in medicine. The Guardian in August reported on racism in the BBC. The social work journal Community Care talked about racism in social work. I think what was most worrying of all was the YMCA Young and Black report published last autumn, reporting results from 549 people aged 16 to 30, Black people. The shocking figures were that 95% had experienced or witnessed racism in school and 86% at work. So this isn't something that's gone away and is clearly still a problem, particularly for people who are already struggling with the problems of dementia.